There are a lot of problems with the American Western diet, and that has contributed heavily to our weight problems, and it might not necessarily be tied to a gluttony thing. Okay, I just want everyone to know that. What does the Bible say about body image and weight and the sinfulness of it? And then specifically going into the topic of gluttony and overeating, overindulgence, those sorts of things. So first, I just want to establish the biblical framework from which we get our principles regarding this stuff. A lot of people know that gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins, but I want you to know that the 7 deadly sins are not found like in any sort of specific list like that in the Bible, right? That's kind of, it's not to say that it's wrong, you know, the list of 7 deadly sins is wrong, but it's more of a man-made construction. So we really want to go to what the Bible has to say about gluttony. Okay, the first passage I want to go to is Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21. Okay, now it says this: "Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for they are drunkards and gluttons and become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags." Okay, so here you got a general principle. One of the things we need to recognize is what type of literature the book of Proverbs is. Okay, we need to recognize this at the outset. The Proverbs are not meant to be do this and this always occurs type of thing, right? The classic proverb, raise up a child in the way he should go and he will not depart from it. And a lot of parents take that as a promise that if you do this, what is said will always result. That is not how Proverbs is structured. Proverbs is general life wisdom. If you structure your life after the Proverbs, generally things will go well for you. If you don't structure your life after the Proverbs, generally things won't go well for you. Okay? That's the structure of the book of Proverbs. And I think it's important to recognize that at the outset. Okay? Once you know that, you realize none of these are promises, but they're really good ideas. Does that make sense? That's what we first need to recognize. Do not join in those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat, for drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. Does everyone you know who drinks too much wine and gorges themselves on meat become poor? No, because it's not a promise, okay? But there's a warning here. If you drink too much wine or you gorge yourself on meat, you become poor, i.e., that is a big financial burden on you. A lot of people in the United States spend many millions of dollars every year on alcohol. And it's something that the body doesn't need. It's, in fact, in many ways, a toxin that your body has to purge, okay? And the point here is that if you are buying extravagant food, gorging yourself all of the time, that's costly. And if you drink too much wine, that is also costly. Okay, so that's the first consideration. There's a general warning here, but it tells you why. Now, another aspect of it comes up. They become poor, but not only that, drowsiness clothes them in rags. Now, I don't think this necessarily means you're just going to be sleepy all the time, although it might reference that in some way, shape, or form. But I think this generally means that sloth, being lazy, accompanies drunkards and gluttons. Okay, so sloth and laziness, these people aren't generally active. They're not necessarily proactive in their lives. Okay, so that's an important aspect. Drowsiness clothes them in rags. So you have 2 warnings against gluttony, against overeating, against what I will call overindulgence. Okay, 2 warnings. One is the financial aspect of it. It's costly. And another is the laziness aspect of it. How many people do you know that kind of live just so they can drink? I don't know about you, but I've known many functional alcoholics in my life who basically drink as much as they can and do just enough to get by so they can constantly be in this like half asleep, half awake state, right? That is not God's plan or purpose for our lives, that we would be drowsy in that sense all the time, not focused on God's kingdom. Okay, so that's an important aspect as well. So this is just a general warning. against the financial aspect of it and against the laziness aspect of it that often comes with it. Who wants to go for a run after a big heavy meal? Nobody. Who wants to work out after, they drink a six-pack? Nobody, right? And that relates to this drowsiness aspect. Okay, so that's the first one. Let's go now to Ecclesiastes 6:7. Now, Ecclesiastes is very similar type of literature to Proverbs. They're not promises, they're general principles, okay? So listen to this. Ecclesiastes is actually one of my favorite books in the Bible. A man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. It comes without meaning. It departs in darkness, and in darkness the name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it has more rest than does that man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, do not all go to the same place? So he's lamenting the meaninglessness of life. And this is just characteristic of the author of Ecclesiastes, okay? And then now here, verse 7. Everyone's toil is for their mouth, yet their appetite is never satisfied. Another good text. Everyone's toil is for their mouth, yet their appetite is never satisfied. What's he saying? He's saying, look, everyone works hard so they can fill their stomachs, right? So they can eat delicious things, and yet they never seem to be satisfied. You constantly have that appetite, that craving over and over and over again. And what he's saying is it gets you stuck in this meaningless cycle of life. Now, again, the author of Ecclesiastes is lamenting this. And he concludes later in the book that what we should do is glorify and honor God with our lives. But what he's reflecting on here, I think, is a trap that many gluttonous people fall into. I mean, how many pints of ice cream do you need to down in your entire lifetime before you realize this isn't bringing me satisfaction? You see what I mean? But because the hunger drive in a human being is so strong, we often forget those same principles that we learned one day ago or even one meal ago, and we go all out after it all over again. And so this is just pointing out that, look, your appetite is never going to be satisfied. You will never find full satisfaction through your mouth. That's not how it's going to happen, okay? And that is something we need to recognize. That is leaning again towards this idea of gluttony or overindulgence. Okay. Google says, reminds me of what C.S. Lewis said. If I find in myself desires which nothing in this world can satisfy, the only logical explanation is that I was made for another world. I love that. That's very, very good, Cool Blaze. Exactly right. But the problem is the hunger drive in human beings is so strong, and God put it there, but we have such a strong hunger drive that we tend to associate the satisfying of our hunger with actual eternal satisfaction, but it never does. It never satisfies. Okay, let's go to our third passage. 1 Peter 4, 3-4, okay? Now, this is what's called a vice list. These are typical in Paul, but Peter has one here as well. And what this is doing is just listing the sorts of things that the flesh desires, the sorts of things that we run after in our fallen flesh, okay? It says this, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join in them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. Peter says, you already did all this stuff. There was time when you were an unbeliever to do all these things. You lived in this manner of life already. Now it's time to step up your game, says Peter. Now it's time to do something additional. Now again, it doesn't explicitly say gluttony here. I know some translations do, but this idea of debauchery, drunkenness, carousing, orgies, it's really pointing out the excess of it. So it's a similar problem, but this excess is characteristic of human beings in general, and we apply it to food very readily and very easily. Okay? So Peter says, you had enough time to do that in the past. You don't need to be doing that now. All right? This is something that you've already spent a lot of time in. Debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. He says to step up and live your life in a Christian manner now instead. Now, the next thing I want you guys to see is I want to balance this a little bit, okay? I want to balance this a little bit because we've been pretty harsh. Yeah, 1 Timothy 6. Listen to this, guys. Now, this isn't specifically talking about food, but I think we can apply the principle to food, okay? This is 1 Timothy 6:17. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. God richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Now, I think this includes food. There's a reason that food is delicious. There's a reason that food brings pleasure and satisfaction to us, okay? So I don't want to tip the scale too far in the other direction, right? Eating is not merely meant to survive. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen The Matrix, but they have to eat that like gruel every morning. They eat like the oatmeal that's, they're like, this is disgusting, but it's got all the things that a human body needs, right, to survive. But it's not good. You know what I mean? We don't serve a God who wants you to like just meagerly eat to sustain yourself and that's it, okay? We don't serve a God like that, okay? So I don't want the pendulum to swing too far in the other direction towards what I would call asceticism, that essentially you just need to, flog yourself and never enjoy your food. It can be awesome to have a good meal, okay? It can be awesome to have a good meal. But here's what we've been pointing out. We, as human beings, tend to take good things in life and make them ultimate things in life. There's a point from which you go from eating a good dinner and saying, wow, God, that was delicious. Thank you so much for providing for me that I could eat a delicious meal, to thinking just about the food and wanting the food. You see what I mean? We tend to make idols out of things that are good. God gives us good gifts for us to enjoy, and we tend to make idols out of them. So God gave you food for you to enjoy, and it's good. It's a good gift from God to have a nice meal. But we have to recognize our inherent capacity and bent as human beings to take the good gifts of God and turn them into idols. We do that very easily. We do it very readily. We've got to watch out and be careful of that, okay? And so I just wanted to balance everything because all of these made it sound pretty bad, and I wanted to bring a little bit of balance to it from 1 Timothy 6:17. God richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment, but we make idols out of things that we enjoy, so we need to be careful. Jesse says, I read this book years ago. It really relates. Made to Crave, Satisfying Your Deepest Desire with God, Not Food, by Lisa Turkist. Nice. That sounds perfect, exactly. You are built. I love the title of that book. I love the title of that book because you are built to crave things. So Made to Crave makes perfect sense. It also reminds me of James K.A. Smith. You are what you love, right? The things you love are the things that capture your attention, your energy, your heart, your passion. And we tend to idolize things that are good. God gives us good gifts and we turn them into ultimate things. That's worshiping, that's praising, and that's what idolatry is. And that's what when we have cravings in those things, instead of craving God, that's what it is. So we need to take stock of ourselves in this situation. Now, all of that said, fasting is specifically marked out for a reason. Okay, fasting is marked out for a reason as a good practice for human beings to engage in for religious purposes. And I've just got a couple of passages here on this, okay? There's a reason that fasting is something that God marks out for us. So Luke 2:37-38, here is a very, very godly woman, right? And she, this is Anna the prophet of Penuel, daughter of Penuel, excuse me. And she is fasting looking for the Messiah, and the Messiah shows up, right? Then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. She worshiped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. Why is fasting so praised in the Bible? Because that desire and that drive to eat so dominates us. It is a very fundamental way for a human being to say no to their physical desires and instead say yes to God's spiritual inclinations, okay? That's why fasting is so popular as a religious thing. And the Bible praises fasting in that sense. And that's not the only passage. Let's go to Acts 13:2-3. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed hands on them and sent them off. So again, fasting and prayer going together. Something about not eating, something about denying yourself that physical urge or physical desire builds self-discipline. It builds spiritual disciplines in your life and in your heart. And that's a good thing that God asks you to do, to build up that spiritual discipline in spite of your physical urges and physical desires. And hunger is a fundamental one that motivates almost all of us. And that's why fasting is something that is a biblical, spiritual thing to engage in. And of course, this goes back to what Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds forth from the Father, when he fasted 40 days in the wilderness, okay, and was tempted by Satan. So, we need to establish that. God has given us good gifts. We tend to make them ultimate gifts. There are a lot of warnings in the Bible against excess in this sense, and fasting is generally praised and honored because denying yourself something physical in order to pursue God spiritually is very, very good. Now, I went into this topic wanting to address also body image and weight. So here's what I want to go next. We assume that because somebody is overweight or fat, that they're automatically falling into the sin of gluttony. And that is not the case. That is absolutely not the case, okay? So, if you look in the mirror and you're not happy with your body, do not automatically conclude that you are falling into the sin of gluttony or overeating. And here's why I want to say this. It is actually typical now in America for an adult to be overweight, okay? Whether that's morbidly obese or just overweight, but it is actually typical now for adults to be overweight. And I don't think this has only to do with us overeating, okay? This also has to do, or I think even primarily has to do, with the types of diets that we're eating. I don't want to go too much into detail on this because this is a Bible channel, but I just want to say this principle. Just because somebody is fat or overweight does not mean they are a glutton, okay? One of the primary things that contributes to the human body putting on fat is insulin, okay? And specifically insulin resistance. And your body builds up a tolerance to insulin over time. And insulin is triggered primarily by simple sugars and simple carbohydrates. And from the time we are young, we are eating foods that are absolutely loaded with sugars. Absolutely loaded. Open up almost anything in your open up your fridge and look at almost any food. Your meat has tons of sugar in it. Your condiments have tons of sugar in it. Your drinks have sugar in it, etc., etc. Sugar is cheap, it's addictive, and it makes almost every food taste better. Put in small amounts. Okay? When we load our foods with sugar and we eat for years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we eat sugar, your body builds up a tolerance and insulin resistance, and that triggering of insulin causes your body to store fat. So you could be even eating a fairly low-calorie diet, trying to muster up all of the self-discipline you can, but the foods you are eating tend to cause you to put on weight anyway, okay? So all I'm saying this is, just because you're not happy with your body the way it is, just because you're overweight, does not necessarily mean that you're a glutton, that you overindulge in food. You might just have insulin resistance of a fairly high order, okay? So I just want to point that out. We shouldn't assume just because somebody is fat or overweight that they are a glutton or they overindulge all the time in food. Yeah, there you go. And I love that. BJ's got it right. The reverse is also true. Just because someone isn't fat doesn't mean they don't have a gluttony problem. Exactly right. Thank you, BJ. Exactly right. Just because you aren't obese, overweight, fat doesn't mean, I don't got to worry about gluttony. Many of those people have very low insulin resistance, very high basal metabolic rates or metabolisms, right? And they can eat whatever they want, however much they want, whenever they want, and never seem to put on weight. They might have a gluttony problem, but it doesn't show because they're not very insulin resistant and their basal metabolic rate is very high. So, don't associate. There are a lot of problems with the American Western diet, and that has contributed heavily to our weight problems, and it might not necessarily be tied to a gluttony thing. Okay, I just want everyone to know that. Now, I wanted to wrap up with this. So I wanted to encourage you guys to consider gluttony, to consider all of those things. But here's where I wanted to end. You can go extreme in the other direction, okay? We are meant to take care of our bodies. We are not meant to overindulge gluttonously in food and drink, etc. But you can take it to the other extreme, where you wear it as a badge of honor that you are constantly depriving yourself and you look down on others because you're physically fit, you look after your body, etc. And so I just wanted to read this tiny quote from John Frame. This is John Frame, Doctrine of the Christian Life, on the topic of food, drink, and exercise. He says this: "As we have seen, we have a prima facie biblical responsibility to preserve our own lives. That implies a regard for our physical health. Today we know more than past generations about what promotes health. Thus, many people put large efforts into crafting proper diets and patterns of exercise. This is fine up to a point. In general, these practices contribute to our witness for Christ. But I would remind my readers of a point I made earlier, that the length of a physical life is not an ultimate priority in Scripture." Here is what he's saying, and I want you to recognize this. Living as long as you possibly can is not a priority that the Scriptures place upon you, okay? Again, God gave you everything richly for you to enjoy. And if you are trying to keep yourself in peak physical condition so that you can live as long as possible, that is not necessarily God's goal or will for your life, okay? It's an important goal, but it's not an ultimate goal, okay? If health and safety were ultimate priorities, then we would guard them above all else. But the Apostle Paul did not do that. As we have seen, he voluntarily undertook a dangerous existence to minister the gospel. That's 2 Corinthians 11 when he talks about all of the things he's gone through. That heedlessness to personal safety was also a characteristic of the saints of Hebrews 11. And behind all of these examples is the figure of Jesus himself, who left the heavenly glory, hungered, thirsted, risked violence, and in the end gave himself up to a beating and crucifixion for us. God has ordained for all of us that this life is to be a time of suffering as we wait for the glory to come. So, if you're saying, I'm going to get rid of my gluttony, I'm not going to be overindulgent, etc., do not swing the pendulum so far in the other direction that you idolize health and all that type of stuff to the point where you have no regard for, enjoying some of the things that God has given us, okay? You can make this an idol in the other direction. And 1 Peter 4:12-13, he finishes off with, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed." God has given us this life so that we can model or pattern our lives after what Christ has done for us, okay? But ultimately, the lengthening of our lives or peak physical health is not a goal that the Scriptures say we should aim or strive for at all costs, okay? So we need to recognize that. So I just want to summarize our ideas, guys. There are biblical problems with gluttony and overindulgence, but God has also given us food as an enjoyable thing for us to enjoy, and we need to balance these two things out, okay? We need to make sure we don't idolize food or fall into gluttony and overindulgence, but by the same token, enjoy what God has given us. We also ought not to make our physical health the prime goal in our lives. It can be a good goal and a high goal even, but we ought not to make it the only goal in our lives. Ultimately, the kingdom, making disciples of all nations, is the primary goal that we should be after. And God has given us some things to enjoy. Just don't make those things ultimate. Okay, you can take this overboard in either direction. Finally, just because somebody physically looks gluttonous or overweight Doesn't mean they actually are. This can be a result of medication. This could be a result of diet, insulin resistance. This can be a result of all of those sorts of things. Okay, so we need to recognize that as well. All right, I hope that was helpful on the topic of gluttony. You know, our bodies embracing what God has given us, and, you know, having an appropriate level of commitment in terms of not making an idol out of food while at the same time enjoying what God has given us. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed that content. If you want to go deeper with us, please head down to the description, hit up the links to Twitch and Discord, where you can be part of this awesome community that we're building and be part of the discipleship that we're growing with together. Also, if you would consider hitting like and subscribe, we'd really appreciate it. Take care. God bless. Bye now.